My name is Leslie Thompson. I'm a settler and guest on the lands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, and I'm joining you tonight in my role as Director of Adult Programs here at the SID. And I want to thank y'all for coming out for our lecture program this evening. Our current exhibition, which is entitled Remington and Russell in Black and White, features some of the artists' works in grayscale that they did for the purpose of illustrations to accompany stories for publications. And both artists illustrated books, often Western novels, which were often written by white men. And tonight I'm interested in going beyond those parameters and exploring how African American writers have understood place and landscape in their interpretations of regional experience. In particular, during the African American literary renaissance of the 1990s, Black women writers produced groundbreaking contributions with a number of prominent authors who turned westward. Writers such as Morrison, Cooper, Rhodes, Clara, and many others chose to focus their narrative energies on communities, histories, and lived experiences of African Americans in the post-emancipation American West. Using historical fiction and drama as a medium, these authors carried forth the Black literary tradition of reclaiming lost histories and giving voice to understudied architects of American democracy. And tonight, we'll look at the impact of these writers' efforts to reclaim a Black Western identity and how the topography of the Western region serves as a staging area for diverse narratives of migration, community, and freedom in contemporary literature. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Kalenda Eaton, who is professor in the Clara Luper Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And she's also director of the Oklahoma Research for the Black Homesteader Project, which is funded by the National Park Service in partnership with the Center for Great Plains Studies. And if you're interested in a Black Homesteader project, she gave a lecture here at the museum last year, and we have a recording of that talk on our YouTube channel. Dr. Eaton is a humanities scholar focused on African American Western studies, intersections of Black literary studies, and feminist criticism, African American social and cultural history, and Black diaspora studies. She received her MA and PhD from the Ohio State University and BA from Dillard University. And Dr. Eaton is the author of Womanism, Literature, and the Transformation of the Black Community, 1965 to 1980. An additional scholarship on representations of African Americans in American Western history, literature, and popular culture. She is known for her teaching and public scholarship on what African American regional experiences can tell us about American cultural and national politics. Recent publications include Black Women Writers Reclaiming Western Literature, the co-edited New Directions in Black Western Studies, and Teaching the Black West with Michael Johnson in Teaching Western American Literature. And we are delighted to have Kalenda with us this evening. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kalenda Eaton.
Here?
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out on a Friday to come be with me today and listen to me talk a bit. And hopefully we'll have Q&A, so I won't be the only person speaking. Thank you very much, Leslie, for the invitation. I was surprised and flattered that you asked me to come back another time. So I really appreciate it. I had a lovely time last year. For some reason, wow, time flies so fast. But yeah, I had a lovely time last year, and I'm really excited to talk about this topic today. There will be a little bit of overlap just because I'm talking about Black experience in the West, but it's going to be very focused on the written word more so than the visual narratives that I presented last time. So let's get started. think I know what I'm doing with this clicker. Here we go. Uh, So I focus on historical fiction in my work, my scholarship, as I also think about the ways in which African Americans and people of African descent have defined place on their own terms in the Western region. And when I'm talking about the Western region, I'm speaking primarily about what we think of as kind of this geographic west, west of the Missouri River. I used to say west of the Mississippi River, but then that west started moving a little bit further, and I was like, okay, I think west of the Missouri River would be a very good example. But that does not mean also that I am excluding the Western Plains north of the 49th parallel in Canada, where you have a very specific relationship between African Americans who came from Texas and Oklahoma and then settled on the Western Plains in the early 20th century, and then also south of the Texas border into parts of northern Mexico. So the West is wide and vast and very kind of interesting. So when I think about historical fiction, I also examine how narrative constructs allows for the kind of this overlooked and these forgotten histories of Black Plains communities to be revealed. And so, as was stated in the introduction, a lot of my work focuses on Black women writers and the ways in which these women uh, write Black experience into existence for contemporary readers, so to speak. And contemporary could mean post 1990. I'm at a point in my life where I thought the 90s was 10 years ago, and now I realize that it was not. And so when I'm speaking to my students, I'm like, yeah, like in the 90s, 10 years, 15 years ago, they're like, you mean like 30 something years? I was like, what? So anyway, so I was like, yeah, so we'll just say contemporary can mean anytime post 1980, 1990. But critical scholarship also demonstrates how gendered retellings of American history often contribute to an added depth to historical recovery projects. And so the core of my research is often concerned with how these concepts of home and belonging and communalism converge during Western migration and settlement. And we'll talk a bit about what I mean by settlement a little bit later. And so I read the rejection of African American integration into the nation during various periods of Reconstruction, post 1889, post 1900, post 1920, as this direct correlation to social complications that we see not only just in the American South when we think about, what happens after the Civil War in the United States, but how the West becomes this battleground, right, in many ways for either kind of reclaiming a Southern ideal or escaping, right? What we would think of kind of as maybe a very suffocating Southern space especially for African Americans. So what you will notice there's a theme. All of the images are black and white, going along with the theme of the exhibition. I got my assignment and I'm trying to stick with it. So you'll see here this image here, and this reminds me of the image that we have out there in the exhibition, jumping onto a horse. And so you have the Remington, where you have one of the buffalo soldiers, right, is horse jumping as an attempt to tame the horse. Now, while this gentleman is not identified as a buffalo soldier, he was actually a sheriff in Pocatello, Idaho. And so if we think then about these images of the West and where African Americans fit into these larger visualizations of the West. It's often with Buffalo Soldiers, often with people on cowboys rather on horses, or often you will have lawmen, Bass Reeves, right, type characters, individuals who are then on horses. And so you have that connection there in terms of this standard image. But this is also a Western image. And this is a family of African Americans who are, obviously sitting for a family photo in East Texas, actually in White House, White House, Tyler, Texas. White House is where they lived, but Tyler, Texas is what you would probably be more familiar with. Even though now, isn't Patrick Mahomes from White House or something? I feel like now everybody knows White House. It just used to be like this little tiny spot. Now people know White House. And so, is there a pointer on here? I probably should. Is there a pointer? I mean, yeah, at the top. At the top. Here. Okay. Thank you. And so you have the children. Well, you have, of course, the matriarch and patriarch. So the mother, father, children, grandchildren here in this photo, and they, of course, are in their Sunday best and posing in a way that also demonstrates a type of arrival. Okay, within a Western space. And we have some telltale examples of what looks Western, right, in terms of some of the clothing here. And then also, if there's another photo of this family outside on their land, on the homestead, and you can kind of see, very much East Texas, right, in terms of where they are in this space. And so this image also is one that I would argue we need to include or incorporate into our understanding of what the West looks like this is particularly at the turn of the 21st century. And that person right there is my grandmother. And so when I was thinking about the theme here of black and white, I was thinking also about the ways in which I encounter black and white images and imagery in my own work with the West, but also going back to this image, my first memories of kind of what African Americans in the West could look like, right? So you have this black and white image here. And then, of course, I spend a lot of time with text, spend a lot of time with archival text, newspapers, in addition to, of course, the advertisements in these newspapers and other examples of narrative and written words that we see in these sorts of spaces. And so here we have a story that is being told. This is the same, I'm going to get this clicker together here. This is the same paper, okay? It's just split in different ways. And so you have here the new lands occupied, no serious disturbances in Oklahoma yesterday. One woman shot for insisting on anticipating the time for entry, thousands of home seekers boldly facing privations. And so this is a homesteading piece, right? I'm talking about homesteading, but it's not post homestead, it is pre, right? It is folks, these are the folks who are waiting, right, to move into the quote unquote open lands, right? And all of the issues that we know associated with what that means in terms of open lands. And so you have here Guthrie, Oklahoma territory. The long expected hour has arrived and the agony is practically over. At noon today, the west border of the territory, some 60 miles was a continuous line of people, there being groups of 400 or 500 every 5 or 6 miles. At Langston were assembled about 1,500 men and women, the earlier arrivals having gone north or south. They were mostly Negroes who had come in from the southern states at the instance of a company having for its purpose the establishment of a Negro colony and the eventual creation of a Negro state, right? And so you have this story starting to unfold of what then the open Oklahoma territory, right, side of Indian Territory looks like for African Americans. But also, I think this part right here is particularly interesting here in terms of for the purpose of the establishment of the colony and also the eventual creation of a state. Okay, so this is an intentional, right, migration. This is an intentional settlement or potential settlement, but it's also an intentional reimagining of what Blackness can look like, right? What Black communities can look like in a space outside of the South. So there's a story being told here. This here is another example, and you have the Rentisville Indian Territory, the pick of the territory. No town can compare with that is being with that is sorry with it that is being promoted for colored people. It's yours, okay? Ideal location, better than advertised, easy payments or discount for cash, right? So this is from one of the local newspapers in Oklahoma. You know, come to Rentisville, which is a Black town, becomes a Black town. Come to Rentisville, the land is yours. Come here, it's better than advertised. There's no better place. And then that takes us to kind of this first reading, and that is Toni Morrison's Paradise. Has anyone read Toni Morrison's Paradise before? No? Let me see, is the next one? Oh, no. Trying to see if the next one was a little lighter. It's kind of dark in here. Okay, so we have Toni. Are you familiar with the text at all? Some people maybe. Okay. So it is a novel that is set primarily in Oklahoma in a fictional town. It tells the story of families who made this move from the southern United States into Oklahoma territory in an attempt to create a home, right, a haven, a safe space, moving away from the domestic terrorism of the South, trying to escape what they feel are very limiting conditions, social conditions, and then they go in and they hear of, you know, these towns that are being created, these communities that are being created, these Black spaces, right, as you see from the ad there, and so they want to go and participate in this and take part in this, right, and so they eventually end up creating their own community. And the novel, I'm trying not to give too much away, so the novel continues on with different scenarios of what happens in their town over the years, different generations, the ways in which the town attempts to maintain its identity even though the world around it is changing, okay? So a lot of what you would think of when you would consider rural life in any space, but there are particular, as Morrison would do, right, particular parts of this text that cause us to kind of think critically about what it means to be a part of this larger national conversation. So I want to read something to you. Here, he said, this is our place. Well, it wasn't, of course, not yet anyway. It belonged to a family of state Indians, and it took a year and 4 months of negotiations, of labor for land to finally have it free and clear. Coming from lush vegetation to extravagant space could have made them feel small when they saw more sky than earth, grass to their hips. To the old fathers, it signaled luxury, an amplitude of soul and stature that was freedom without borders and without deep, menacing woods where enemies could hide. Here, freedom was not entertainment like a carnival or a hoedown that you can count on once a year. No, nor was it at the table, excuse me, nor was it the table droppings from the entitled. Here, freedom was a test administered by the natural world that a man had to take for himself every day. And if he passed enough tests long enough, he was king. So this passage here speaks to a lot of what we saw in those earlier slides. Okay, freedom is what this space becomes, okay? And it's not the kind of freedom that we think of just in terms of like liberation, right? Being liberated from, chains or liberated from enslavement. But there's a different type of freedom that is associated with this passage, and that is a freedom of self-determination, the ability to make oneself in this space, and also to take control of one's destiny. And so when you have this statement here, here freedom was a test, but then also in this space, if you pass that test, right, the individual becomes king. There is also kind of this idea of what sovereignty looks like, right, for African Americans in these particular spaces. Here's another example of an advertisement in one of the newspapers: "To men of color, to our colored friends throughout the United States, we send you greeting." And then it goes on and speaks about, the Indian Territory and Oklahoma now being a state. So statehood statehood began in 1907. Thousands of our native people are landholders and have thousands of acres of rich lands to rent and to lease. We prefer to rent and to lease our lands to colored people. Our terms will be found reasonable. Good land, good water, good school on foot. It should be best climate in the world. If any of you have traveled a little further north, I don't know if it's the best climate in the world, but you are invited to come and share and enjoy our lands and our prosperity, right? So back to this idea of being king, back to this idea of being able to identify a space that is one's own and then be successful in that space. It says the land of the free and the home of the brave, right? Going back to the Morrison here, right? About freedom and what freedom means. Freedom is a test, okay? The land of the free and the home of the brave. And if you were not sure if this were legitimate in terms of, who is enticing people to come to these spaces, who was enticing people to come to these spaces, you have then this testament at the bottom: Reverend E.W. Smith, pastor of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, right? So therefore, Reverend Smith has put his stamp on this because there were a lot of people who were saying, "Oh, come out to these lands, oh, come to these spaces," and they would take people's money, and they wouldn't necessarily be scrupulous. I don't know Reverend Smith. I don't know if he is scrupulous or was a scrupulous man or not, but I'm just saying, sometimes people were being tricked. So why am I showing you this as I am, of course, talking about literature and kind of reading these narratives? Because a text like Paradise does not exist purely, in the imagination of a writer like Toni Morrison. Morrison comes to this text because of her work as the story goes, because of her work as an editor early in the 1970s. And she was working on this piece called The Black Book. And The Black Book is a collection basically of ephemera, of different articles and images and broadsides and what have you that really trace the story of African American experience in the United States from the beginnings until at that point, the present. Okay. And she came across an article, and this particular article had a title that really struck her as being interesting. And it said this: "Come prepared or not at all." This is the actual article, right? come prepared or not at all. And so she says, as she was reading this, it really struck her that in a time when people were being, forced out of their homes, when they were running away, right, from places that they had known to be home, seeking solace in these spaces outside of the South, the North, right, the Far East, and moving into the Western environment, that there were people who were there, who had gotten there a little bit earlier, right, who were like, yes, we are here, we are established, but by the way, if you think that you are going to come here with no money, right, with no protection, with no industry, we will turn you away, right? And so Morrison famously says, when she read this particular article, that it made her think about, what it means for African Americans to turn away other African Americans in this moment, right? And so she writes Paradise. Paradise is a product, right, of this engagement with the black and white, right, with these particular newspapers that she comes across. So it says basically that we admonish our people to be on guard and not be seduced into the idea that the general government is going to take care of you after you get here, or that they can or will assist you in the matter of paying your railroad fare. We especially invite people of our race who have some means to come. We warn those who have nothing that this being a new country, talking about Oklahoma territory, peopled by strangers with no ready employment, and everybody husbanding what little cash and effects he or she may have until conditions change, that they will surely suffer by the change. So come prepared to care for yourself and family by all means, and you will make no mistake. If you come penniless, you must expect to get it rough, as you ought to do. That, if that's not Western, I don't know what is, right? So I think, so going back to the novel, just to kind of make this connection here, Morrison writes, on the journey from Mississippi and two Louisiana parishes to Oklahoma, the 158 freedmen were unwelcome on each grain of soil from Yazoo to Fort Smith. Turned away by rich Choctaw and poor whites, chased by yard dogs, jeered at by camp prostitutes and their children, they were nevertheless unprepared for the aggressive discouragement they received from Negro towns already being built. The headline of a feature in the Herald, "Come prepared or not at all," could not mean them, could it? Smart, strong, and eager to work their own land, they believed they were more than prepared. They were destined. It stung them into confusion to learn they did not have enough money to satisfy the restrictions the self-supporting men required. In short, they were too poor, too bedraggled looking to enter, let alone reside in the communities that were soliciting Negro homesteaders. This contemptuous dismissal by the lucky changed the temperature of their blood twice. First, they boiled at being written up as people who preferred saloon and crap games to homes, churches, and schools. Then, remembering their spectacular history, they cooled. What began as overheated determination became cold-blooded obsession. They don't know we or about we, said one man. Us free like them, was slave like them, what for is this difference? Denied and guarded against, they altered their route and made their way west of the unassigned lands south of Logan County, across the Canadian River into Arapaho territory. So this here, of course, speaks about self-determination, but coming from some place a little bit different, right? So it's not just the determination to go into these spaces and develop community, but also the determination to prove that they belong, okay? Now, what I think is interesting is that that particular description, I mean, even though this is a novel, right? That particular description of south of Logan County, moving over across the Canadian River into Arapaho territory, describes actually this space here. And this is a piece that's kind of illuminated, and it's identifying one of the land runs in the Cheyenne Arapaho territory, and the opening, quote unquote, of those spaces. And if we know anything about the land runs in Oklahoma or know anything about the Homestead Act, in order for spaces to be open, people had to be removed, right? Jamaica Osorio, who was a Hawaiian activist and poet, has said often, you have to think about who had to be removed for you to be here, right? And so you have this space here that they moved to, and this is far west of Oklahoma Territory. Here's a description of this space. As of June 30th, 1892, Territorial Governor Abraham J. Say estimated that only 7,600 settlers lived on the land, which is a very small number given the hundreds of thousands of people who were settling in the Western territory, part of the territory. Even in 1899, historian Edward Everett Dale said that one could ride west the whole day without seeing a homestead. Why did settlers decline to take part? First, more people considered the region so barren that about the only sure crop was the rattlesnake, right? So this is the space that then Morrison brings into the novel and says that this particular group of people were basically forced to move into because no one would allow them to move into their communities anywhere else. Right? The indigenous would not allow them. The African Americans would not allow them. They were being run away. It goes on. They were being run away left and right. And so they're moving and moving and moving and trying to find a safe space, trying to find this haven, and they cannot. And so they end up in a barren land, which I think is kind of interesting. We think about some of those connections to settlement. Another text that is important in kind of thinking about this larger Oklahoma story is Citizens Creek by Lalita Tademi, which is she's known for many of her novels, one being Cane River, which was a very popular text when it came out. So in 2014, she publishes Citizens Creek, which is this historical novel, which is described as being about, quote, little known histories of Native Americans and African Americans and Indian settlers and slaves. This is a quote from the text. Tademi is most known, as I said, for Cane River, which is a novel that's based on her family history, and then also Red River, which is a continuation of this story, and this starts in Louisiana. With Citizens Creek, however, she describes her decision to focus on the story of a Black Creek family led by Cal Tom, who was an actual person, a prominent contributor to the Creek Nation, and eventually a chief known to few outside of his descendants. Cal Tom was an enslaved member of his tribe, yet a translator, confidant, cultural broker, and eventual political actor representing the Muskogee Creek Band, the Upper Creeks, in treaty negotiations with the federal government. The novelist was given a book about Cal Tom's descendants and immediately wanted to learn more about him. She says, quote, I wanted to find out more about the unique position held by certain Black men in 19th century tribes as translators and intermediaries between the 5 quote unquote civilized tribes in the US government. And I was equally interested in the women in their lives who made it possible for them to succeed. And so this novel has several parts, but the first part is controlled by kind of this haunting. One of the primary characters named Rose is haunted by her twin brother, who is deceased. Her brother acts out through her, and this can be read in many different ways. But as a surviving twin, and possibly because she is the oldest grandchild, she also has the responsibility for cleaning and tending to her brother's grave. And this daily ritualistic walk across the tall grass and into the forest becomes a part of her identity pre-removal. So the family begins in their original, on their original ancestral land in the southeastern United States, and then we trace them as they are removed through the Trail of Tears into Indian territory. And so she uses this time to commune with nature and solidify her connection to the land that she knows. Post removal, she feels very out of place. She's not certain that she belongs in the new, unfamiliar place. And there seems to be kind of this lack of spiritual connection to her brother because the grave was left at home, right? So there's this disconnect. And we know that these, even though again this is a fictional text, that this historical novel is based on many narratives, oral history narratives, and experiences of people who had been removed, forcefully removed from their ancestral land, and that break, right, between the two, and kind of always this need to get back to that space. There's kind of this definite subversion in the novel of the pastoral after the family moves to Indian territory. And this journey signifies a very ecological devastation. There is death and hunger and loss and violence and trauma in these spaces. And Rose becomes a figure who is tasked with holding the family's stories, holding the history. But the interesting thing is that the stories don't become this record that are then passed down and as we think about with oral history, but they become this weight for Rose because she is told she can't tell any of the stories. They have to all be a secret. She is the one who was chosen to hold the stories, but she also is told that she's forbidden, right, to pass them on. And so there's this decades-long refusal to share the family history with the next generation that we see throughout the novel. And there's a tense scene between Rose and one of her sons where she forbids him to sell his allotment of the 160 acres that he receives. And this is long, of course, after they have been removed into Indian territory. And the Dawes Act, right, is kind of taking place, right? All of the actions around that, and then the land is being carved up, and the indigenous inhabitants of the tribes are receiving, right, their 160 acres, and there's a lot of kind of push and pull, and of course, eventually, right, the land that is taken from the government is that land that becomes this homesteaded land for others. And so anyway, there's this tension between the two. And there's this passage here that I want to highlight where she says, never want what other people have. You never know how they got it. And the son, Eugene didn't back down, as if his silent witness to this morning's meeting drained him of his full capacity for obedience. I don't belong here, he said. And then Rose's heart skipped. What did he mean? On the ranch, on this porch with her? Not everybody wants to farm or ranch for the rest of their life, he said. That's not what I want. What do you want, Eugene? Rose asked. Do you even know? Do you have any idea? She fully expected him to withdraw into himself as he usually did when confronted, but he took a deep breath and looked her directly in the eye. I want to live away from cows and mud and dust and chickens. I want to ride a train headed west or east. I want to live in a city and meet people not knowing who I am or where I'm from, whose first question isn't, who are your people? Who don't peg me Creek or Cherokee, Indian or freedman, cowpunch or ranch hand. I want to sleep long in the morning and stay up with the moon at night, without a thought of a cow needs milking, or a crop needs picking, or a herd needs running. I want to see something new that man made. More than drinking enough rot gut whiskey to face another day of hard winter or hard summer and not use up my praying for rain during drought or sun during flood or calm during tornado. I want out. And so this passage, I feel, is very powerful, and I think it's an interesting way for the author to bring in some of these larger conversations about rural communities, right, rurality, but also what it meant and what it means for people who have been kind of separated and removed from home, right, and what that looks like, and then kind of how they are attempting to recreate spaces in this new location, and then the kind of breakdown between that attempt in the next generation. It is the same scenario that we have in Paradise. It's a totally different novel, same scenario, okay? And it's also a very Western, right? A very, very Western reality, especially rural Western. So even though Eugene is the one who says, I don't belong here, in that novel, Rose is the one who was constantly grappling with where she fits into this landscape as well, feeling as an outsider. Kansas. So there is a play titled Flying West that I talk about all the time, and I need to join the Pearl Clegg fan club because I'm always talking about this play. It is one that focuses on African American women who are homesteading in Kansas in the late 19th century, and they are in a space, a town called Nicodemus, which is to date, the oldest remaining homesteaded town that still exists and is still occupied in the US. It is in Kansas, and there are a lot of descendants, a lot of people who have been working hard over the years to maintain that space and maintain that legacy. Angela Bates being one of these people. There's scholarship about Nicodemus. There are children's stories about Nicodemus. It goes on and on and on. And so this is, again, thinking about this black and white imagery and the way that we understand the West, right, in black and white. This is an example of another one of those broadsides, ho for Kansas, right? I feel thankful to inform you that the Real Estate and Homestead Association will leave here the 15th of April, 1878, in pursuit of homes in the southwestern lands of America at transportation rates cheaper than ever was known before. And this is signed by Pap Singleton, who was famously interviewed by the federal government for his attempts to remove thousands of African Americans from the South. What are you doing? Why are they following you? Why are they going out of there? And so he has this interview that you can actually find online. There was an entire committee that was formed to figure out like why this migration was happening, not just to Kansas, but people were moving all over after the end of the Civil War. And so while this drama, in the play is fictionalized, this interpretation of Black women's frontier experience, I think, is really important because there are several truths that the play is based upon. You have this intentional forethought designed to preserve communalism and ensure progress in these spaces in which the family lives. There's also an awareness of this relationship between the vastness of the land around the individuals, the pride of ownership, and also this path to citizenship. And it's also noted frequently in the play that there are these outsiders who, due to greed or racism or whatever the case may be, are attempting to remove the individuals who have come into this space from that space. And so, again, I'm not one to give spoiler alerts. I'm giving you all this information so you can go read these novels and read these plays. But I will say that there's this disruption that takes place. There is this attempt, even within the community, for people to change the face of what this immigrant community looks like. And also there's a threat that's posed to this community. So in the play, Pearl Clegg cautions against what can be seen as this unhealthy reliance on the self, right? If we think about this, self-made man, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And this ideal of, being independent, right? Okay. And so there's this caution against that because as we see in many of these other examples that I've given before, the community must take care of itself in order for it to survive. And so she includes these women in a way that I think is important also when we're thinking about history. Often there's this break between fiction, right? And then what is historical? And people think, oh, this is a novel or this is a play. It may be historical fiction, but it's just quaint. Or it's or it's a film or a movie that's a period piece. Oh, that's nice. Okay, Bridgerton, whatever the case may be. Okay, but what we find here when you read Pearl Clegg's play is that there were not only just the invented people within the pages of her book, but there were hundreds and hundreds of African American women who were participating in homesteading, who were farming, who were on the land on their own, right? And these are stories and experiences that largely go untold. They think about, a kind of a particular face of what the West looks like, a particular idea even of what the Black West looks like, if we wanted to consider that, right? But seeing women who are, there as the pioneer woman is not one of those faces. And so she talks about this in this particular play. The women in the play rely upon each other, not because they can't do it alone, but because it doesn't make sense to, right? And so several times you have this one main character, Sophie, admonishing others, and she says, I want this town to be a place where we can be free and we can live our lives like human beings. I want it to be a place where a child can go to anybody's door and be treated like they belong there, right? So again, thinking about, and these are images from the Library of Congress of what Nicodemus looked like in the beginning. And again, of course, it is a living, breathing town. People live there now. This is a church here. This is the first church. I think this was a rebuilt one, if I remember correctly. So these are some of the people, the townspeople. You also have these images here, right? And so when we consider, again, the West. What does the West look like in terms of these images of the horses and the cow rustlers and the mountains and the prairie? And then what does the West look like when we start to add in these other stories, right? In terms of the families and the communities that are attempting to make a space, identify some sort of place for them as well. So I will end, and I will end with this piece, which is actually not by an African-American woman. This is Kenneth Young, As Some Things Appear on the Plains and Among the Rockies in Midsummer, another piece that I like quite a bit. And it is a pamphlet that is also housed in the Library of Congress. And it's an interesting story. I won't go into a lot of it. I know I've been talking for a while, but basically Kenneth Young graduates from college, gets married, and then says, I think I'll take off and see the West. He's living in South Carolina. He goes to school in Atlanta. He lives in South Carolina. And so it's, right after he is married, he wants to do kind of this last hurrah, right? And he hops on a train. I've always been curious to know, what, how and why, but he hops on this train and he goes all throughout the West. The Rockies. At some point, he jumps off the train and starts backpacking among the Mormons in Salt Lake City. I mean, it's just in Utah. It's just interesting all together. And then he comes back home, and he's living his life. And his friends say, "Hey, Ken, you should really write about this. You should really talk about this experience." He's like, I'm not really a writer, And so they keep pestering him. And so eventually he says, okay, fine, right? And he puts together this little pamphlet, right? It's like it's a tribal narrative. That's what it is. And he recounts his experience. But a couple of key things I wanted to mention about this piece. So he's kind of enthralled with this allure of the Great Plains, topography, including the vast expanse and natural beauty, what he sees as the protection from human evils that isolation ensures. And he writes of his travels, quote, in traversing Kansas for hundreds and hundreds of miles in one direction, casting a sweeping glance across the plains, there rise before the view fine pastures and boundless. And on crossing into Colorado, as far as the eye can scan, there seems to be be yet beyond an unlimited expanse of prairie that in the distance presents a picture of admiration and wonder. For miles and miles, there appears to spring into existence a boundless scope of territory that in the far off approaches sublimity and recedes before the eye like a vast ocean green. That's how he writes often. I mean, like you'll see this all throughout the way that he describes the landscape. And what I find to be interesting, and I've written a piece about this, is that he's writing this in the 1890s, right? He's just like, oh, I'm on this train, and oh, look, everything's wonderful and beautiful, right? He doesn't speak about encountering any indigenous people. He doesn't speak about encountering any African Americans. He does have a few examples where he encounters Anglo Americans on the train, and they have this, he does talk about kind of racial difference at some point. There is also a point where he remarks that as soon as he crosses into Missouri, or outside of St. Louis, I should say, he can feel like the weight of, race falling off of him. I mean, I go to town with Kenny's doing a lot here. But anyway, the thing that I find to be particularly interesting is the time in which he is writing. And so there are these ongoing political and economic issues. There are these ongoing political and economic realities of migration. So the Oklahoma example that I showed you, that's the early 1890s, okay? This is when Ken is on this train, right, riding around. You have settlement, you have boosterism, you have, of course, continued removal, people who are being pushed and pulled. You have the rise of coming up, like the rise of more kind of racial terrorism again, Jim Crow and all this. And Young remarks in this piece, oh, there's no sign of life for mile after mile, except the birds and animals native to the region. His observations include creatures of the plains that catch his eye. He remarks that the prairie dog is the king of the field, and comments that even birds are cognizant of their solitude as they are, quote, far from the habitation of man and music, singing only to warn its fellow fowl of danger, right? Kenneth Young could easily write a piece to accompany one of the paintings, right, out in the exhibition. And so I take a little bit of a different stance with Mr. Young here, and I see that he's kind of exhibiting kind of this privilege of racial avoidance in his writing, which is his prerogative to do. But this silence comes with this idea that the West, particularly the Plains and the Rockies, are spaces where he can afford not to consider, right? What his life is like in South Carolina, what life is like for others in South Carolina. And so it's this idyllic West, right? This West that we kind of see, right, in Hollywood, right, or we see, right, in the early Westerns, of this space where, one could be great, right? One could actually just kind of move across this expanse, no matter who the person was, and make something of himself in this particular case. And so most of his rail stops across the plains actually do bypass towns and depots that would place him in direct contact with communities. But at some point in his writing, he does talk about equality, social equality. He does talk about politics, but he says, I go with reluctance, climb the heights, and leave discrimination further behind. The further into the Western region he travels, he becomes increasingly removed from human life and more self-assured. And then also you see that he becomes more confident in his writing. And then later in the piece, and kind of the last part of that piece, he says that this is because he's breathing this different air. This Western space has a different air for him, right? And so I think all of these are just kind of particularly interesting. I don't know how to go back. Particularly, I just wanted to go back to the beginning, to the first slide. Particularly interesting because these are examples from, in the Kenneth Young case, 1890s, right? And then maybe one back or okay, the other way. Here we go. Our There we go. That's what I was trying to do. These are examples of ways in which, again, from the late 19th century, people are writing about the West and how they see themselves fitting into the space. And then later, moving forward to the latter half of the 20th century, you have people who are reflecting on the history, the archival history, bringing that history into the novel and writing about what we would probably think of as kind of like these imagined spaces, right? And these imagined communities in which people can thrive and live and experience all of the various different highs and lows that we would anyway, right? But the West becomes this backdrop for the possibility of something else. And that's where I'll leave you with today. So I'll leave you with today. I know I've been talking a lot.